Dear students, dear guests, welcome to our joint seminar, Human Rights and Introduction. This course is a partnership between the Global Awareness Education at the University of Tübingen, Germany, and the Federal University of ABC, Brazil. This course aims to make the topic of human rights accessible to students of all disciplines and from different countries. We will study the history of human rights and look at specific issues related to refugees, public security, gender, minorities, and the role of the arts, focusing on experiences in different parts of the world. Guest lecturers will bring fresh perspectives from different disciplines and regions of the world. At both universities, the course will be offered to students from different disciplines. In Tübingen as part of the Global Awareness Education in the Transdisciplinary Course Program, and as a free extension course at the Federal University of ABC. The course organizers are Professor Gilberto Rodrigues from the Federal University of ABC and myself, Glaucia Pérez da Silva, University of Tübingen. So today we will hear the lecture on addressing LGBTIQ plus human rights in the Caribbean and the Americas by Cristhian Manuel Jiménez and Yahir Zavaleta from Amnesty International in Mexico. So I will give the word to Gilberto to introduce our guests.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you in this second class of our human rights course, an introduction to human rights. For me, it's a great pleasure to introduce you, both guests we have here today. I would like to begin with Cristhian Jiménez. He is an expert in human rights and inclusion. He's from Dominican Republic. He has a background in international relations and social sciences. He studied international relations in the Dominican Republic, and then receiving a scholarship from the Organization of American States, he spent some years studying in Brazil. I had the pleasure to be his supervisor in a master's program in social and human sciences, and he was a brilliant student there. And he took a master's degree from the Federal University of ABC. After that, he went back to the Dominican Republic to coordinate a program of the United Nations Development Program on diversity rights in Central America and the Caribbean. And after some years, since then, he joined the International Amnesty in Mexico to coordinate another program related to communication and a campaign for the Caribbean region. So you will be benefited to listen and to interact with Cristhian, who is a credible expert in human rights and a very committed person to the defense of diversity rights in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, in the world. I also, for me, it's a great pleasure to introduce you Yahir Zavaleta. He is from Mexico. He works in the International Amnesty in Mexico. He is a project coordinator of Diversxs, a regional initiative of Amnesty International to promote human rights of LGBTIQ plus in the Americas. So thank you very much for you both to be with us, and I give the floor to Cristhian to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Glaucia and Gilberto. Thanks for inviting us, and good morning and welcome all to this lecture. As Gilberto said, I am from the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean. That's why we are also talking not only about the Americas as a region, because there is a sub-region, the Caribbean, that it's always many times forget from the global arena, and it has the particularities that are very interesting to know. So I am right now the regional campaigner for the Caribbean at Amnesty International, in our regional office in the Americas. Amnesty has a very particular structure. We have our international as headquarter where we belong, the regional offices, and we have the Americas regional office, the European regional offices, the African regional offices, the Mid-Eastern regional offices, and also the Asian regional offices. And we also have sections that have in each of the countries where the movement exists. In the case of the Caribbean, we only have Puerto Rico with a section. That means that those countries of the Caribbean, the rest, I am with a partner who is the researcher. They're responsible to follow up the human rights situation, and they're responsible to do the strategies to overcome the situations in the country. And as Gilberto said, before I came to Mexico to work on Amnesty, I worked for 5 years in the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, coordinating a Caribbean project. The name of the project that still exists is Being LGBTI in the Caribbean. I suggest you to look at in Google, in Instagram, and in X, because it's the main project right now of the international cooperation that is leading efforts to promote inclusive policies, enhancing data, and also strengthening the civil society in 5 countries of the Caribbean. And I'm really thrilled to speak with you about the LGBTIQ plus human rights in the Caribbean. And with my partner, with Yahir, we will talking about how the international law has expanded on this population and how the challenges and progress have been happening in this region. But thanks, Yahir, also for being here. Go ahead, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Cristhian. And hello, everyone. I'm happy. I'm really honored and thrilled to be here to sharing this lecture with you. Just a little bit of context about me. I'm from Mexico. I live in Mexico City, but my hometown is 2 hours away from here. So I have been working on human rights and LGBTIQ and HIV related issues since 2008. It's been like almost 20 years. Oh wow, that's quite a lot. So yeah, as a gay man, since I started like coming out of the closet and realizing that it was like a very tough environment for LGBTIQ people, not only here in Mexico but in the whole the Americas. I just yeah started looking for safe spaces, friends, and people that I can relate to, and so that I was starting involving in some very small groups, organizations, and then eventually, after finalizing my university studies, I started working on human rights issues. So I work on the Human Rights Commission here in Mexico City, and I work also in a few to grassroots to medium size organizations, mostly focused on LGBTIQ and HIV related issues. And then 6 years ago, I started working on Amnesty International. So from that, all that work and all that background, I can say that yeah, it's been like I always remember um, sharing this idea, these thoughts with some colleagues, like maybe 10 years ago, like if we will be able to see the changes that we were fighting then back then in 2014, I think it was 2014, in a it was a LGBTIQ and HIV conference, a global conference, and there was like a very like hidden discussion about like yeah we have been saying and we have been fighting and we have been discussing the same for quite some time. And then when I look the when I turned out the look around and I see like, well, it was 10 years ago. Some of these things have made some progress. Some of those challenges still remain here in our current context. But yeah, the thoughts that the conclusion that I have back then in 2014 and that I have now in 2024 is that it takes some time, it takes some patience, but it takes a lot of effort from activists, from people, organizations, and networks, and yeah, that are working there, like in different contexts, in different scenarios, with a lot of challenges. So I think we're really happy to share this lecture, these ideas, these thoughts with you. Some of you may have heard a lot about it, some of you may not, but that's the point of this lecture, that we can have all this common understanding. So we really appreciate the time and the space. I will start sharing my screen. And with that, the first thing that we want to do with you is to make like this sort of ice-breaking space. So just let me know if you can see the presentation. Okay. So yeah, Christian, I think that you were already mentioning the objectives of this of this lecture, of this session, and so I will jump into the this ice-breaking exercise. So you may know Kahoot. It's an app. It's a gameplay app. So I will ask you to either get into the link, the www.kahoot.it, and just they will ask you to type the pin, or you can scan the QR code, the barcode, the QR code, sorry. So that the QR is for if you have a mobile phone with you, and the pin is if you are in your computer and you want to join in the in your browser. So I will also share it in the chat. Sorry that I just stopped presenting it. So there you have the URL and you have the pin. So yeah, I will jump into the. Okay, I see a lot of you joining there. Perfect. We will just. I know that there are like around 50 people in this lecture, so we will give one more minute. We are in 31. So yeah, let's just give a few more minutes. This exercise is basically, it's very brief and just basically to kind of test or kind of map out, sound out your knowledge about some kind of obvious things that we have heard all the time, every day, like like sexual orientation, gender identity, LGBTIQ. I mean, I'm sure all of you have heard about the LGBTIQ acronym, but some of you may know what does that means in terms of like how is it related to our daily lives. So yeah, it's basically a very brief exercise, and then we will start running on with the concepts and the thought and the hard information. So we are 46 already. Just one more minute. Sorry, one more seconds, and I will start. So this is very intuitive. When I start the game, you will have the chance to either in your screen, or I mean in your computer or in your mobile phone, to choose the right answer to each of the questions. Are only 5 questions, so yeah, I think we can start now. We are 48. I think we're most of the room there. Okay, I will start. So, have you ready? And there it goes. In your screen, it will appear naturally the yeah, each question. So, 3, 2, 1, ready to play. This is a true or false. So, a person's sexual orientation determines his or her gender identity. That is true or that is false. Also, remember that the ones that actually respond first are the ones that will be gaining more points. 43 answers, and the time is running out. So the right answer is false. Person's sexual orientations. So a person's gender identity is independent of his or her their sexual orientation. So basically, the sexual orientation is the ability of a person to feel emotional, affective, and sexual attractions to another person or other persons. So gender identity is the individual experience of gender as each person's feel it. It's a very individual experience of what is entitled to gender identity. And the gender identity, may or may not correspond to assigned sex. So hopefully you get your answers right. So next question. So this is a quiz. You will have to choose the right answer. Which of the following is not an example of gender binarism? You may have heard of gender binarism. So we have these four options. So which of those is not an example of gender binarism? We have male and female, man or woman, monogamous and polygamous, and heterosexual and homosexual. Okay, so I think most of you actually got the right answer. So monogamous and polygamous is actually not an example of gender binarism. So gender binarism, what is gender binarism? It is a dominant social and cultural model based on the naturalization of a supposed coherence between sex, gender, body presentation, genitalia, emotions, eroticism, desire, social roles, and other characteristics in all human beings. That is basically how the world is intended to rule. Like either you're a male or you're a female, or you're a woman or you're a man. So this is basically like binarism, like in terms of like the idea that gender should be only in the two poles or in two sides. So this is not necessarily that it's right, but it's the way that for many, many years we have been living, or we have been opposed to the way that we should be living. So that is gender binarism. So the next question is: a cisgender person a person whose gender identity corresponds to the sex assigned at birth? So once again, is a cisgender person a person whose gender identity corresponds to the sex assigned at birth? So this is true or it is false. We have 7 more seconds for you to answer. And let's see if you actually got it right. Okay, so yeah, that is true. A cisgender person is a person whose gender identity corresponds to the sex assigned at birth. We only have 9 people who maybe might be confused about what is a cisgender person, but that is good. I mean, somehow we expected that these concepts might be like very known well from all of you. So yeah, beyond cisgender, what is cisgender? As we mentioned, is the correspondence between the sex assigned as a birth and then the gender that a person plays in her daily life. But what is like not necessarily the opposite, but a part or beyond cisgender, we have the transgender person. A transgender person is one whose appearance and characteristics are perceived as gender atypical or not perpetuating traditional gender assignments. So that is, if I was born and I'm the doctors when my mom was given a birth to this baby, and I was named like I'm a male person, I am a man person, and then in the course of my life I realized that I don't feel myself like as a man, so as a man, so my gender identity, for me, and the way I perceive myself is being a female or being a woman. So that is what is intended or what is understood as a transgender person, someone whose whose appearance and characteristics are not necessarily in coherence or in concordance with the sex that was assigned as birth. So we are almost there. Next question is: a queer person is one whose identity rejects binary categories of male and female. I'm sure that you have heard about that a person is a queer person, or the queer theory, or like the queer movement. But what does the queer term actually means? So okay, so yeah, the right answer is true. A queer person is one whose identity rejects binary categories of male and female. But it's not just that. So yeah, binary categories refer to sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity. As we already mentioned, it's in terms of sexuality, it is of either you're a man or you are a female. In sexual orientation, either you are homosexual or heterosexual. So actually, what is intended, what it's meaning for a queer people is that they might define their gender on a scale between male or female, or they might define it as something completely different from these terms. Like, I don't identify myself as an heterosexual, neither from homosexual, so something in between, so something like that flows beneath these two concepts. And some people actually queer people actually identify themselves into the trans category, but not all of them. So maybe a non-binary person might identify himself or herself or themselves as a binary, a queer person, but not necessarily. Okay, so I'm sure that there are a lot of terms that might feel like sort of confusing to you, but we will have time in the Q&A to actually, yeah, detail some of them. So the last one, heteronormativity is to conduct myself in my daily life and my environment according to the sex as I was assigned at the birth. So this tells you it is true or it is false. Once again, heteronormative is to conduct myself in my daily life and my environment according to the sex I was assigned at birth. So yeah, I know that this question might be not completely clear. So yeah, the right answer is false. But I mean, not only, it could be that heteronormativity is the way that I conduct myself, yeah, in a way that in the way that my sex birth was assigned, but also heteronormativity is a set of practices and institutions that legitimize and privilege heterosexuality and heterosexual relations as a natural foundation of society. This is something that we live every day. Like, if you are a trans person, if you're a queer person, if you're a gay person, a lesbian, you all the time hear like, okay, yeah, but you should be behaving, you should be conducting yourself in a proper way, in a way that society actually accepts it, in a way that we have been told that we should be conducting ourselves according to these heterosexual, cisgender, like what is natural for us to hear in the daily life. Yeah, some of you may have all the concepts very clear, and some of you don't, but we will have time to go in detail to these concepts. But first of all, we want to give like this screenshot or this panorama of how's the situation in terms of LGBTIQ rights. So, Chris, I'm giving the floor to you to start addressing the lesson.
Thank you, Yahir. I was also participating without being in the app, and it was a very interesting game. So let's talk about what the international law says about LGBTI human rights. And let's begin with this phrase: there are no exceptions. What does that mean? The first thing we need to remember and understand is the universality of human rights, which establishes that everyone, without distinction, is entitled to enjoy all the human rights everywhere without exceptions. That means that if you are gay, you are not rejected to go to school. If you are a woman, you are not rejected to go to a hospital. If you are a foreigner, a migrant, you are not rejected to seek asylum. So that's the universality of the human rights. And when you study the fought for the LGBTIQ human rights recognition, you will find this discussion between states in the UN that relates to a history of how difficult has been for the United Nations and all the countries to have a consensus of this important principle of that everyone and everywhere have the same rights. There is a part of the countries that still thinks that there is a relativism on the human rights, that the human rights depends on the context, on the religion, on the custom of each country. And this thing of universality is an imposition of the countries that won the Second World War. But the reality is that the universality of the human rights is the core value of maintaining peace, of promoting democracy. For the UN, it's a core value to keep people alive, to keep the solidarity between human beings. So this is a key principle that we will talk today, and we will need to have it in mind when we speak about the LGBTIQ plus human rights. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was approved in the General Assembly of the UN, the human characteristic that those countries identified at that time was about how to prevent discrimination. The only ones that were written was race, color of your skin, your sex, your language, your religion, your political or other opinion, your national or social origin, the property, your place of birth, or your or other status. If you see, there are no sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression. There is no people with disabilities. They did not put your age, if you are a children, if you are an older person, but they include at the end of that article this word, other status. And the inclusion of other status is intentional. This is called in international law an open clause. It was included because human beings are very creative in finding new ways to discriminate against other people or groups. This open clause gives any human rights instrument, like a treaty, a convention, also a national law, the possibility to include new categories to be protected, as is the case for people with disabilities, the indigenous people, older persons, children, and LGBTIQ plus people. And another important principle that we need to remember or know is the pro hominem principle. It's a key concept in human rights law, prioritize the interpretation of legal norms in a manner that most effectively protects individuals' rights and freedom. This means that when we have a law that doesn't include, for example, people with disabilities, we try to read it in the most convenient way to include them, if we think to have a more enhancing environment, and a more enabling law environment. This principle mandates that when we face various interpretations of a legal text, the one that offers the greatest protection to the human being should be chosen. It serves as a guiding framework to ensure that human rights are interpreted and applied in the broadest and most beneficial way possible, thereby strengthening human rights protections and making the rights more effective and accessible to individuals. For example, many countries decriminalize laws that punish same-sex relations. What they did, they have a penal code that sets that individuals of the same sex that were found having sex will be punished by the law. But for the other, in another law, they have, for example, in their constitution that everyone is entitled to all the human rights. That's the principle of non-discrimination that is in almost all the constitutions of the world. And they also have that the privacy is a human right. So the judge saw both laws, and he chose the Constitution, the principle of non-discrimination, or the right to privacy in your life, before picking the penal code. Why he did that? Because he did an interpretation using the pro hominem principle in favor of the people. And so these two principles are very necessary to know and to use when we talk about enhancing the protection of human rights to any minority, including LGBTIQ plus people. So using these two principles, the United Nations have and other human rights mechanism has this position that governments who refuse to protect the human rights of LGBTIQ plus people are in violation of international law, because these two principles are part of the core of the international human rights law. The problem is that the reading of this open clause varies between countries' authorities and the judicial systems. It's not the same, the judicial system in the Dominican Republic as the judicial system that you have in Brazil or in Mexico. That's why we have right now more than 60 countries in the world where there are laws that punish same-sex relationships. And we have other countries where we have equal marriage or the the right to adopt children by same-sex couples. So there is a lack of a standard of the LGBTI human rights respect between countries. That's why the LGBTIQ plus movement in many countries in the world are advocating for the inclusion of these categories of sexual orientation, gender identity, intersexuality, and others in their own national laws, so that these rights are explicitly recognized and protected. By amending the law to include these categories, you will have a clearly position from your state that LGBTIQ+ cannot be excluded from the same protections that anyone in the country are entitled to. So this advocacy is crucial if we want to win the battle against discrimination and violence that many LGBTIQ+ people face around the world. The push for explicit legal recognition also holds governments accountable, making it more difficult for the state and non-state actors to perpetrate or condone acts of discrimination. And it also promotes inclusion on public policies, and it also promotes changes in the attitudes against sexual and gender diversity. Another important message is that I think maybe you have heard that activists use human rights are LGBTIQ plus rights. And this phrase is to respond to this anti-rights movement that says that LGBTI human rights are new rights, or they want privileges in our society. But that's not true. The truth is that the LGBTIQ plus movement and people, they are pursuing the same rights as you and me are entitled to. But many governments and societies deny them. So that's why we need them in laws, in resolutions, in public programs, in public plans, because there is a need to have it explicitly there so people can understand that is part of the state to promote the rights for everyone, including LGBTIQ plus people. Another topic is that the international protection of LGBTIQ plus rights has been seen as significant progress, as Yahir said, in the last 10 years. But in the international law, is the most progress that we have right now is in what we call soft law. That in the case of the United Nations, that are the Committee of Human Rights, the Committee against for the elimination of discrimination against women, or the Committee against torture. Those mechanisms or committees or treaty bodies are part of are a key body of each convention or pact that protects the universality of human rights on different topics. But we also have progress in the Inter-American human rights system or the European human rights regional bodies. But the problem with the soft law is that it's not binding for the states. Soft laws include resolutions, declarations, guidelines, and they play a role in shaping norms, in influencing the states to behave in a way regarding to the respect of the LGBTIQ plus people. But that is not enough for many countries. For example, now we have resolutions from the UN Human Rights Council in favor of the rights of the LGBTIQ plus people, but many of the countries, when they vote on those resolutions, they vote against it. So there is not a consensus as we will all vote in favor of a resolution of children's rights or women's rights. There is still a clash between countries when they face each other in the international arena about what it means being LGBTI. It is legal or no, it is moral or no. Can a country says to me that I need to protect them or no? So this is still a big problem. The universal human rights we need right now, all the universal human rights or the UN human rights treaties and convention do not explicitly include sexual orientation or gender identity in their texts. So this leads to an interpretation from the treaty bodies of each convention. But as it is a soft law, many of the countries of the state parties don't care about that interpretation. And this gap doesn't that we don't have a binding global standard about what it means, the responsibility of the states before their citizens that are LGBTQ plus people is a manner that we will need to keep advocating to have a global treaty about this in a few years. Maybe an example of that kind of treaty is the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance. This convention includes protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, but right now only Mexico and Uruguay has ratified it. But this is a very good example that can be also used in other regions and also can be a base for a UN convention in the future. So now Yahir will speak about another effort from the civil society worldwide in order to push for more standards of what it means to protect human rights of LGBTIQ plus people. Yahir?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the Jakarta principles, which is basically this summit that was developed a few years ago. Basically, this this was like the result of convening organizations, human bodies, and activists from different places in the world to actually commit, like have like a common understanding and position about what is LGBTIQ rights for these, as Chris already mentioned, this legal framework, international legal framework, and how that can be related to the, like country principles and country for mostly for, I mean, just for UN members, for countries that are UN members, that actually can commit and submit these principles in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity. So basically, the Yogyakarta principles is basically to emphasize that all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, are entitled to enjoy the protections provided by international human rights law. So that is in terms of whatever the context in your country is, or the position in your country is, that they should be protecting the rights of LGBTIQ people in terms of the international framework. As Christian was mentioning before, Many UN treaties or recommendations or governance bodies are not necessarily binding to local legal frameworks in their countries. So unfortunately, even the Yoga Carta principles out there, it's not necessarily that it's like a set of a platform of recommendations or guidelines for UN members and countries to actually engage with them and fully and actively start implementing some actions to secure lives and dignity of LGBTIQ people. But this is not necessarily binding. They are not necessarily obligated to conduct all of these efforts. Um, so once again, the principles provide this clear guidance of how international human rights law applies to issues concerning sexual orientation and gender identity. This is basically in terms of, for example, um, economic, social, and cultural rights in terms of like how LGBTQ people should have access to decent employment or access to health services that are actually very tailored and according to the needs for instance, for transgender people, that those services, those rights are actually fully accessible, but also in a way that they respond to the needs as LGBTQ people. This is actually it's a tool for advocacy. So in case, like as we mentioned, those are not necessarily binding principles or platforms, but in case that some civil society organization networks and activists can use these principles to actually advocate in their countries, because there's a resolution like in the Yoga Carta principles, that you can ensure that your country or your state actually can relate to these principles, that it can secure some specific laws and policies that might be addressing these challenges and these difficult contexts for policymakers, for legislators, for decision-making persons in your country, but also in your community or in your states, to actually make some changes or conduct some actions for programs or policies that respond to the context and the challenges of LGBTQ people. Um, so basically, also it's a way that even if in countries like in the Americas, but I'm sure that in many other countries in regions in the world, it's very difficult to actually monitor human rights violations for LGBTIQ people, like for example, hate crimes, or access to justice in case of a human rights violation, or for instance, if a person is denied to access to employment or access to health because it's denied because of sexual orientation or gender identity. So also the Yoga Carta principles or the platforms that it provides, it's basically for states to remain accountable for the missings or for the human rights violations that are committing against LGBTIQ people. So basically, what I'm trying to say here, as of the conclusion of the Yoga Carta principles, is that as these, there are many other efforts, regional or global efforts, that are pursuing that LGBTIQ people in terms of advocacy are actually that states in terms of LGBTIQ rights and LGBTIQ people remain accountable of what is these global discussions in terms of how we can conduct and have good practices and have like proper legal frameworks that respond to the needs and challenges of LGBTIQ people. So this is basically how we can um, make states accountable for that, and how basically just bearing in mind the context that LGBTIQ people, specifically those more affected for hate crimes or the hate speeches or the anti-rights groups, like I don't know, like transgender people are actually actually their rights or the accessibility to their rights are actually being covered as well. So I think we have a Christian. If you want to talk about a little bit about the UN and the framework for LGBTIQ human rights.
Sure. So let's talk about the significant progress on the protection of LGBTIQ plus human rights in the framework of the United Nations. First, the LGBTIQ plus people has faced and still face opposition from three major institutions. One is the science, which historically categorize them as having a mental health disorder. The second one are the states, when they use the law to penalize them for being themselves or deny their human rights. And there is the religion, which views them as contrary to moral values. On the first one, the science, that is related to the UN, one of the significant earliest achievements at the UN was the depathologization of the homosexuality in 1990 by the World Health Organization. More recently, a major milestone occurred in 2019 when transgender identity was no longer classified as a mental disorder. Both decisions have a significant importance because they alter societal attitudes towards LGBTIQ plus people, because they are not now being told that they have a mental disorder or mental issues because they love a man love another man, or a person who doesn't recognize with the sex that was assigned at birth. And this is a huge change for not only for LGBTQ plus people who were denied rights because of this thing about them, but also it changed how the society behave around LGBTIQ plus people. Now many countries are also adopting laws against any kind of therapy that conducts to alter the sexual orientation or gender identity of the people. Those kind of therapies, they are not therapists, there are efforts do those used for supposedly scientists or psychiatrists or people from the professionals from the mental health that endangers the health of the people who are affected, and also one of the consequences of those therapies is that many of the people who conducted them try to suicide, or it also have other kind of consequences for their own health and stigma. So this was one of the biggest gains in the UN, the pathologization of homosexuality and the change of the perception of transgender identities as no longer both classified as mental disorders. A second win in the UN was in 1994. It was the case Tonen versus Australia. I don't know if you know, but all the states that have ratified the International Human Rights, Civil and Political Human Rights Pact of the UN, they accept that the Human Rights Committee, who oversees the respect of this convention, to know cases when the victims thinks that they have used all the national system, justice system, and the national justice system has failed them. They can brought their cases to this committee to see if the state has committed a violation of the convention or the pact. And this was the case in Australia. Tonen, in that moment in 1994, the state of Tasmania in Australia has still the criminalization of same-sex relations. So, and Tonen brought this case to the committee, saying that Australia was violating his right to privacy. And in that case, the committee gives the reason to Tonen and says that Australia was violating the International Convention of Civil and Political Rights. And Australia, even that the cases on these treaty bodies are also part of the soft law, so the states are not have the obligation to change their laws or their attitudes in the country. In the case of Australia, they moved to decriminalize homosexuality in the country. In that case, do not only change things in Australia. From that case, the UN started to speak more openly about LGBTIQ plus rights and started to promote that all the UN member countries started to do the process to decriminalize homosexuality if they have it in their own laws. But and also with Tonen, we have other cases. The UN started to do reports. The treaty bodies started to do general recommendations, and the soft law inside the UN and the treaty bodies and the independent experts, they started a body of work in favor of the human rights of LGBTIQ plus rights. The UN so remember that the UN was started in the 1945, and it was until 1994 that the UN started to speak about this population. So it was a debt to the LGBTIQ plus people from the UN for a long time. The most recent resolution was the Intersex Rights Resolution this year in the UN Human Rights Council. It's a huge progress for this population too. There is also a group of countries who advocate in favor of LGBTI human rights. Inside the UN, the name is the United Nations LGBTI Core Group, and it was founded in 2008. Inside the UN, they call it the Rainbow Group, and it is composed by many of the countries of the Americas, European countries, South Africa. Also, South Africa was one of the champions inside the UN to promote that other countries from the South, like Africa and Asia, started to have better attitudes in the UN in favor of resolutions. Why you think is that? That's because when they approved the new constitution in South Africa, they included in the constitution the non-discrimination based on sex, on sexual orientation. In that, and they include that because the LGBTQI plus movement or activists play part of the fight against the apartheid in South Africa. And they see that if they wanted to construct better South Africa, it will need to include then all people. And that's why it is interesting to see that South Africa has a different position on LGBTI human rights issues in the UN and worldwide in comparison with other African states. Also, since 2016, the UN Human Rights Council created this independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, and it was the action of this core group that play a big role in constructing a consensus on this to adopt this new independent expert. because, as I said, this topic creates a clash between regional blocs. There is still, when the topic is brought to the UN, most of the countries of the Americas, of South America, North America, and Mexico, and Cuba, and Dominican Republic are in favor of LGBTIQ plus rights. Also, the regional bloc from the Europe, maybe some countries from Europe like Hungary or Poland sometimes are not in favor of LGBTQI plus rights, but most of the European and Latin American and Canada and US are in favor of this topic in the UN. And then you have the rest of the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, where most of the countries are against. Other countries from Europe, like Russia and the Holy See, are against too. From Africa, we only have like South Africa, and from Asia, we have South Korea and Japan that are in favor too, sometimes Thailand. And from Oceania, we have New Zealand and Australia, but there is still a clash between regions on this topic. And since the mandate of Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, the UN was perceived as for the LGBTI movement as the biggest champion, from Kofi Annan's statement, and then Ban Ki-moon, and now Guterres. They have been champions on this topic. Well, the High Commissioner for Human Rights has established the following international responsibilities for all states. The first one is that all the states should protect people from violence and prevent torture and cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. All the states need also to ensure that people are not detained or arrested on grounds of their sexual orientation or gender identity. All the states should prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and also all the states should promote a culture of equality and diversity to promote respect for the human rights of LGBTI people. Now let's talk about the challenges and progress in the Americas and the Caribbean. Yahir?
Thank you, Chris. So bearing in mind that we are also running out of time, I'm gonna be like very quick in terms of like giving you this picture of what's the situation of LGBTIQ rights in the Americas, and then Chris is gonna talk about a little bit about the Caribbean. So this map basically reflects these little spots, these orange spots are those countries who are still criminalizing consensual same-sex relationships, which is basically Jamaica, Grenada, Saint Lucia, Guyana, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So even if you look like, okay, pretty much it's well, like basically the whole continent, including, well, it's not seen the US and Canada, which are also, they have decriminalized consensual same-sex relationships. So you will see that, okay, it looks good. It's like very much of the continent, of the region, it's has a proof. It's not criminalizing anymore consensual same-sex relationship between people, but this is not necessarily a good reflection of what's actually happening in reality. Even in countries like, I don't know, if in Paraguay or in Brazil or even in Mexico, it's legal to like the same-sex relationships. It doesn't necessarily reflect like the context. Like we are still dealing with a lot of violence, discrimination, a lot of hate crimes of LGBTIQ people. So for instance, in terms of gender recognition, only 20 countries have like laws and policies, which not necessarily means that there are comprehensive laws and policies for trans people. 20 of them are actually can in 20 of these countries in the region, people can actually access to change the legal name. So that is basically if I am if my name is Jair and I was raised and I was born like as a male, and then I discover and I reaffirm that my gender identity is actually being a woman, and I consider like a transgender person. In 20 of these countries in the region, I can easily, let's say easily, access to change my name. Um, that is one of the, let's say, like the most basic sort of procedures that for transgender people to actually like have like a proper um, set of policies and procedures to actually dignify their lives. In 10 of these in 10 countries, in terms of changing name for a transgender person, it is nominally possible to legally change their name. That is, it is written in the constitution, it is written in penal codes, but then it is the structural barriers like homophobia, transphobia, cisgender heteronormativity that actually do not allow them to access to this legal chain of their names. Because even if, once again, like I will say the case of in Paraguay, even if they can, the constitution says that it is possible to change your name if you are not. It doesn't talk about like being a transgender person, but it's basically that for all citizens that want to change their name, they have to conduct a administrative procedure. But for transgender people that actually want to access to change their legal name, it has been denying because of structural, basically for transphobia reasons. So once again, even if you see this map, like it's mostly blank and it's mostly in terms of like it's not criminalizing same-sex relationships, deep inside there is still a lot of challenges and lack of access to some other rights. So in terms of, as I was mentioning, violence and discrimination is one of the top priorities in each country in the region in terms of that we want or we need to fight. According to Transborder Monitoring, which is this platform that actually monitors and documents all the crimes against transgender and transgender persons, people in around the world. From between 2022 and 2023, there were 321 orders of trans and gender diverse people worldwide. These were, of course, cases that were reported. Of course, the number is much more higher, considering that most of them are not recorded. They are not monitoring. They are not necessarily being monitored by authorities, and not even say about like accessing justice. From that number, the 321, 74% of these crimes were committed in Latin America and the Caribbean. Brazil is actually the first country with the highest rate of crimes against transgender people. So this is basically one of the biggest challenges in terms of LGBTIQ rights. We know that countries are not criminalizing anymore, but they are still killing LGBTIQ people. So this is very concerning. Also, in terms of impunity and lack of legal protection, as I just mentioned, there are not necessarily procedures, not administrative or legal procedures to actually that can monitor, that can document, and that can provide access to justice to this, to no records actually, for official records. I mean, like most of these numbers are provided by organizations or networks that are actually documented, because they are basically doing the hard work in documenting and receiving the cases of LGBTIQ people that having that have been violated in human rights, or they have been harassed, or they haven't suffered violence, or of course those crimes that are committed against LGBTIQ people. For instance, in countries like Guatemala and Peru, impunity is widespread with no official hate crimes record, hindering protections and justice for LGBTIQ people. Also to mention that only Colombia and Chile have restrictions on interventions on intersexual childs. So yeah, in terms of anti-LGBTQ legislation, a lot of countries actually, for instance, as I mentioned, also in Paraguay, there is no this non there is no like a legal platform, no laws and policies to prevent for any kind of discrimination against LGBTIQ people. So basically, there's no legal protection for people to actually say like, yeah, okay, it's in the constitution that I cannot be discriminated because of my sexual orientation and gender identity. So that is very concerning, as well as in the US, for instance, that I'm sure that you have heard because it's been going very viral. Like, for instance, like a drug person cannot provide shows or cannot provide like educational or promotes any kind of they cannot do any kind of promotion for LGBTQ rights in schools or sometimes in public spaces. So there's a lot of a lot of policies and ruling against LGBTQ people, and that is also very concerning because they're not. It's not only in terms of LGBTQ. This is like a broader scenario in terms of reproductive rights or comprehensive sexual education. It's basically a backlash in terms of like what we are seeing right now in the Americas, which is also very similar to what we are seeing in Europe or in countries that somehow we have some kind of progress in terms of LGBTQ rights. In the case of the MENA region or in Africa, situation is much more concerning, like in Uganda or in Ghana, where there are countries like they have like very restrictive, punitive, and criminalizing laws for LGBTIQ people. So this is basically trying to make like the comparison of how the Americas comparing to other countries. Definitely, and once again, it's the MENA region and in Africa, Western Central Africa and East Africa, the countries that most suffer of punitive laws of against LGBTIQ people. So in terms of the anti-rights movement, I'm sure that you have seen because it's all over the world, not only here in the Americas, but also in countries like, I don't know, in Netherlands or in Italy or in Poland, that we have seen like how decision-making persons or politics are actually taking spaces and are actually promoting these hate speeches with discourses or with narratives against LGBTIQ person and all the things entitled to it. Once again, comprehensive sexual education, abortion. So that is like basically a package of of narratives that are threatening the lives and dignity of LGBTIQ people. For instance, in Argentina, with the recent the elected president Javier Milei, who has been like like having like very hard statements against how he want to like not keep allow that LGBTIQ rights keep advancing. For instance, Milei in Argentina, he basically what he did is that he closed the the National Institute Against Discrimination. This is basically one of the most concerning things, as because this was basically the one of the institutions like receiving these denounces of violations against LGBTIQ people. So we don't have anymore that capacity in Argentina. Or for instance, in Paraguay, recently the Ministry of it was like, I think it was 2 months ago, Ministry of Agriculture, he made a statement that he prohibited gay persons or gay people to students to attend a school, the agriculture school, because it was not allowed and it was not like a thing that the national school programs should be allowing. So this is like really concerning in terms of like how these narratives and how like decision makers are promoting these hate speeches and are still criminalizing persons and legitimizing these narratives that ultimately conduct to people to violent LGBTIQ persons, but also to commit hate crimes. So once again, and then in terms of the structural barriers, is, as I mentioned, LGBTIQ rights is just one piece of the big portion of what we call the progressive rights. Comprehensive sex education, abortion, those are rights that have been very threatened because of these anti-rights movements and the conservative wave just rising up each time, and they have a lot of funding there. They're very well organized. So these are actually these are interconnected or what we call intersection between LGBTIQ rights and also the gender-based violence in terms of racism and migration. So it's not the same like being an LGBT person from urban areas that being an LGBTQ person, indigenous person, or being a black gay man, or a black lesbian, or a black person who is migrating, for instance, for gay persons, or for gay people, or lesbian persons, or intersexual, non-binary persons from Haiti or from other regions in Venezuela that are migrating. I mean, the structural barriers are more tough, and even more they condemn LGBTQ people to access LGBTIQ rights. So also we have seen a backlash on, as I mentioned, sexual and reproductive rights and comprehensive sexual education. There's some
Okay.
progress as well. You will see like there are like some in terms of policies, but also, yeah, I'm not gonna go into detail in each of them, but just to mention that maybe what is relevant to say is that LGBTQ people are participating in political spaces and decision-making bodies. Still, the anti-rights movement and the conservative groups are much more organized, and they have a lot of funding. But also we can also notice that the visibility of LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ people in business, media, sports, arts, and entertainment, it's much more clear now, much more bigger visibility of LGBTQ people. Yeah, Chris, do you want to talk about the challenge very briefly about the challenges in the Caribbean?
Yeah, the Caribbean shares the same problems as the continent, as the region, as the Americas. What is different from the other Latin American countries is that still 5 countries of the Caribbean have laws that criminalize same-sex relations. This is Jamaica, Grenada, Saint Lucia, Guyana, and St. Vincent and Grenadines. But there is a movement from civil society trying to overcome this in different judicial systems. The other thing challenging is in Cuba, because since May 2019, the government has imposed a ban on any pride parades in the country. And also, there is a lack of legal avenues in all the countries in the Caribbean, maybe not in those who, like Puerto Rico, and those who have there are extraterritorial countries like Aruba and the British Islands. Uh, there are no legal avenues to denounce discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And a progress to mention, the next slide, is that many of the English Caribbean countries have decriminalized same-sex relations. The last one was Dominica last month. Cuba and Puerto Rico recognize equal marriage. Cuba is the only country in the sub-region that have the non-discrimination clause based on sexual orientation in the Constitution. The Dominican Republic have 6 laws and 7 national plans that includes LGBTI people, although those laws and plans doesn't have a really strengthened implementation from the authorities. There are also pride parades in almost all the Caribbean countries that wasn't like that 5 years ago. And now we have more data about the life, the social and inclusion gaps from of the LGBTI people in the Caribbean. Next slide.
Thank you, Chris. And just this is the last thing before we finalize. It's the importance of recognizing the LGBTIQ movement. This is basically networks, organization, activists, key spokespersons that are actually pave the way for LGBTIQ rights to be to make sure that we have the rights that we have now, and there's still a lot of progress to make. So basically, just to mention that the right to protest has been a key tool for people to advocate, to actually visualize, and to call for governments, authorities to guarantee and secure LGBTIQ rights for people. from Stonewall to what we have seen now, like the big pride events in Buenos Aires, in Mexico, Brazil, as Chris was mentioning, the fact that in many countries in the Caribbean we can celebrate pride events, it's a very good sign. But also in terms of advocacy, a lot of collectives and networks and organizations have been playing a key role in what we just mentioned in the whole presentation, in terms of like the UN treaties, or like the policies and laws that have been secured in many countries. All of this is because of the LGBTIQ activists and right defenders that are there all the time, constantly fighting for LGBTIQ rights. So yeah, this is it right now. Yeah, I mean, Christian, if maybe you can complement if you want. Just to mention a couple of examples, three examples actually, in US and Mexico and in Brazil. I know that in Brazil, for instance, they have like in mostly in Rio, and I think in Sao Paulo, and here in Mexico, in Mexico City, and maybe in some other state here in Mexico. And the US is much more common, but they have like these clinics or these health spaces for transgender person. Of course, that in order to have that in set in place, like in countries, it's basically definitely necessary to have like this gender maker change, or for actually people to actually have access to change their legal names. Otherwise, it's very difficult for health services to actually being able to receive and to access to provide health services for transgender persons. So one, it is guaranteed, like in the case of Brazil, Mexico, and the US. It's a matter of actually having a having political or a political commitment to actually respond with health services and clinics and hospitals that can provide trans, in this case trans, because I'm talking about trans community because it's the most affected in terms of health services, that they can actually have like for transgender women, like for trans people, the hormonal therapy conversion, and also for endocrinologists and some other services that are very necessary for trans persons, for trans people. And yeah, but this is like those spaces, like once again in Brazil, Mexico, and the US, that I am aware that they have friendly services for trans community. In terms of gay people or lesbian, or some other of the spectrum of LGBTIQ plus, I think they're more familiar in some cases, not just mention intersex, maybe for intersexual persons. I think we have a lot of way to do there. But for gay or lesbian, for gay men and lesbian women, I think they're more friendly spaces, services, in terms of. But once again, most of them are focused or allocated in urban spaces. We cannot necessarily talk about like for indigenous people or rural communities with lack of services in terms of health services are very deficient or inefficient in these spaces, regardless of LGBTIQ persons. That's health services in many of the Latin American countries, and I'm sure in many other countries in the world, is have a lot of challenges there. But once again, like in the urban areas, there are like a good practices of clinics providing services based on the needs of transgender or gay person of lesbian women. So yeah, that's the information that I have. Christian, not sure if you want to jump in with something else.
There are not good samples in the Caribbean. um, Beginning that only Cuba and Puerto Rico are the only countries that accept the change of the gender marker or the change of name. So beginning from that, imagine when you go to a health service, there are no guidelines or good treatment for transgender people.
Basically the role that Amnesty is doing is trying to, I mean, let's start with saying that Amnesty International, it's been like a recent uh, relevant actor, let's put it that way, for LGBTIQ rights. I mean, Amnesty International has been like an amazing work in many other fields, but in terms of gender equality and specifically for LGBTIQ rights, it's been like, let's say 10 years from now that it's starting to started being like a relevant actor. And what I can say is that basically here in the Americas, in something that we are very proud, not only in the Americas but in the whole movement, is the way that how we have invested and how we have like being like very key in terms of positioning LGBTIQ rights in the Americas. the Diversxs project, the one that I have been leading for 3 years now, 4 years now, it's a very good example. It had external funding, but the way that it has been shaping and having addressing needs of LGBTIQ people, all of them young people, has been very particular in the way that we have created safe spaces in countries like in Venezuela when we have a humanitarian crisis, in Paraguay when the conservative groups are very well positioned, in Peru, well, also conservative waves and also the cultural context is not very supporting for LGBTIQ rights, and in Puerto Rico, in the Caribbean, in a sub-region or in a region where LGBTIQ rights have been very punished from decades, historically. I mean. So with that in mind, let's say that yeah, this Amnesty International has been an enabler for LGBTQ activists who have been there for much more time than Amnesty has been there, and has been the voice that Amnesty International has in the global arena, and how we can connect like local and community voices to actually uplift or pitch those messages into this global arena and these global spaces, and how we can also here in Amnesty we have learned to actually work closely with the communities and learn their procedures in terms of advocacy, in terms of mobilization, in terms of how they connect and they how support themselves in a context like, I don't know, like in the pandemic, or in countries like when LGBTIQ rights are threatened. I think it's a very good example of how we are addressing like these like global narratives and these local contexts, and how we can connect these both spaces, and how we can also make sure that in terms of what is written there in Amnesty's mission can actually be something relevant and a tool for activists and local organizations and networks to count in to uplift and to actually make sure that they can have their rights secured in many different spaces. So yeah, I think I'm not sure if that's responding to the question, but this is basically the thing that we are doing in Amnesty.
That's the point of this lecture. When they created the status of refugees, they didn't think in LGBTI people, and it
No.
is not in the test. But the interpretation that countries have done and the UN have done have enhanced the protection from all people, including the LGBTI people. And you give the best example. Thank you.
Well, just very brief advertisement space. Like, yeah, you can basically, and something that we can do is to donate to become a member of Amnesty International. This is a very good way because it gives you the space to actually have like a voting voice in your country, the country that you are located. We're basically in more than 90 countries around the world, so I'm sure that there will be an Amnesty office there. Otherwise, you can actually share the information that we produce to sign up into your in our social media accounts. We can share in the chat in a little bit later. But this is basically, yeah, promoting the work that we do, not only in terms of LGBTQ rights, but in many other issues. For instance, Chris is very focused on the Caribbean, and there's a lot of things happening there in the Caribbean, and things that you can support, that feels that you can feel entitled to, or that you can feel encouraged to support. There are a lot of topics we in Amnesty do a lot of things. So LGBTQ rights and gender, it's just one little piece of all the amazing work that Amnesty does. So yeah, let's make sure that you follow us on our social media, not only the Amnesty as a global, but Amnesty in the Americas as well.
You can be a volunteer. You can sign petitions online. You can be a human rights activist. Anything will help.